Welcome to Shatter.
My wife went silent for 10 days, and the strange part wasn't the silence. It was how public it was. It started at work, not at home. In the open atrium outside the executive floor, where conversations were meant to be overheard, she stood 3 feet from me and spoke as if I wasn't there. Her voice carried, confident, warm, practiced. People stopped when she spoke. They always did. Emily had that kind of presence. HR leadership, polished posture, the smile that made senior managers linger longer than necessary. That morning, she was briefing a small group near the glass railings. I recognized 2 directors and 1 man I didn't see often, David Keller, external investor, VIP client, the kind of name that moved meetings and delayed decisions. I paused with my coffee, not hiding, not intruding. Just there. She laughed at something Keller said. Not the casual kind. The kind that landed and stayed. Her body angled toward him, blocking the rest of the group. Her hand brushed his arm when she emphasized a point. It looked natural. Rehearsed natural. Someone asked a question about internal restructuring. Emily answered smoothly, referencing a strategy one had modeled weeks earlier. She didn't look at me. She didn't credit the analysis. She didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Keller leaned closer, lowering his voice. She nodded, attentive, focused. When he smiled, she matched it instantly. I waited for the moment she'd turn, even briefly. She didn't. At lunch, it continued. Same floor, different room. She passed my table without slowing, phone to her ear, speaking softly. Not to me. She didn't text. Didn't glance back. Her silence wasn't absence. It was a decision. At home that evening, she moved through the space like a guest. She answered emails on the couch, took a call on the balcony, showered with the door locked. When she crossed paths with me in the kitchen, she nodded once, polite, distant, professional. Day 2 looked the same. Day 3 confirmed it wasn't accidental. By the end of the week, others noticed. A colleague asked if Emily was traveling. Another joked about how busy HR leadership must be lately. Keller's name came up more than usual in internal threads. His projects suddenly moved faster. Emily stayed silent. 10 days of proximity without contact. 10 days of being treated like furniture. I didn't ask why. I didn't interrupt her orbit. I just stopped standing where she expected to see me. The first real shift didn't come from Emily. It came from someone who had no reason to protect her. Late in the morning, Mark from Risk Analytics stopped by my desk. He wasn't close enough to gossip and not distant enough to be careless. He hovered longer than necessary, eyes flicking toward the glass corridor that led to the executive wing. He mentioned Keller casually. Said his name the way people do when they're checking whether you already know something. He talked about an expedited approval path that had bypassed 3 internal controls. Said HR had pushed hard for it. Said Emily had been unusually invested. I didn't react. I adjusted a spreadsheet. I asked him to resend a data file he'd already sent. Mark hesitated, then added one more detail. He said Keller had requested a closed-door meeting the previous evening. Not with legal, not with finance. With HR leadership only. He said it wasn't on the standard calendar, but everyone on the floor knew it happened. When Mark left, I didn't move for a while. The floor noise settled back into its rhythm. Keyboards. Footsteps. The low hum of systems running correctly. At lunch, I watched from a distance. Emily and Keller sat together in a side conference room with the blinds half closed. Not enough to hide, just enough to suggest discretion. She leaned forward when he spoke. She listened with her whole body. When someone passed by the glass, she shifted her chair slightly, positioning herself between Keller and the hallway. I noticed something else then. Her phone stayed face down. That evening at home, the silence tightened. She moved faster, more efficient, like she was minimizing friction. When I asked a neutral question about dinner, she answered without looking up. Her tone was flat, professional, the kind she used on employees who weren't worth correcting. Later, a notification lit her phone on the counter. She picked it up immediately. Too immediately. Her shoulders tensed, then relaxed. She took the phone with her into the bedroom and closed the door. I didn't follow. I didn't ask. The next morning, an internal update hit my inbox. Keller's investment review had advanced again. The justification cited people strategy alignment. That phrase came from HR. I recognized the structure of the memo. Emily had written it. Or someone had written it for her. At work, she passed me again without acknowledgement. But this time, there was something else in her posture. a confidence I hadn't seen before, as if she'd crossed a line and discovered there was no immediate cost. That was when I understood the silence wasn't punishment. It was replacement. I didn't confront her. I didn't check her phone. I didn't ask questions that would force her to lie out loud. I did what I'd always done best. I stayed inside the system and watched how it moved. Emily became predictable once I stopped trying to reach her. Her patterns tightened. She arrived earlier, left later, synced her schedule around Keller's visits. When his name appeared on internal calendars, hers adjusted within minutes. Not overlapping publicly. Adjacent. Convenient. I started noticing the smaller things. Expense approvals routed through HR that didn't need to be there. Travel requests fast-tracked with vague justifications. A new line item under talent retention initiatives that quietly covered private meeting spaces off-site. Clean language. Soft edges. At home, the distance sharpened. She stopped leaving her laptop open. Stopped charging her phone in shared spaces. When she spoke to me, it was functional. Short. Controlled. She treated the apartment like a transitional space, not a life. One evening, she left her tablet on the kitchen counter. Not unlocked. Just unattended. A notification banner slid across the screen before it dimmed. A calendar reminder labeled DK alignment. Location attached. Not a company building. That was enough. At work the next day, I pulled historical access logs under the pretense of a routine audit. My role allowed it. No alarms triggered. I wasn't breaking rules. I was reading them closely. Badge activity told a clean story. Emily's card and Keller's visitor access intersected repeatedly in places that didn't host meetings. Not frequently enough to look reckless. Not rarely enough to be coincidence. I didn't save anything. I didn't forward files. I didn't take screenshots. I let the information sit where it belonged, mapped in my head. What changed wasn't my behavior. It was my availability. I stopped taking the informal route through the executive floor. I moved my lunch hours. I declined optional meetings. I rerouted communication through official channels only. When Emily emailed me work-related questions, I responded politely and precisely, copying relevant stakeholders. At home, I mirrored that distance. Calm, neutral, unavailable. She noticed the shift by the end of the week. Not because I withdrew emotionally, because I removed friction she hadn't realized she relied on. The silence she'd created stopped feeling like control. It started feeling like space she couldn't cross. One afternoon, I saw her watching me from across the atrium. Not smiling. Not confident. Measuring. That was the moment I understood something else. She hadn't gone silent because she was done with me. She'd gone silent because she thought I'd stay where she left me. By the time her silence crossed into the second week, it had lost its edge. What remained was habit. And habits are easy to disrupt if you stop feeding them. I didn't leave town. I didn't vanish from the company. I stayed exactly where I was supposed to be, just no longer where she expected to find me. I adjusted my mornings so I arrived before most of the floor filled in. I left after the last wave cleared. I stopped parking in the garage she used. I took different elevators. I shifted my presence into places that didn't overlap with hers unless it was unavoidable. When it was unavoidable, I kept it formal, clean, brief. At home, the change was quieter. I stopped syncing my schedule with hers. I stopped waiting. I stopped filling the space with small talk or routines that made life easier for both of us. Dishes were done when I was done eating. Laundry moved on my timeline. I slept earlier, woke earlier, moved through the apartment like a temporary resident with a clear plan. She noticed the absence before she understood it. One evening, she stood in the kitchen holding her phone longer than necessary, pretending to scroll. She glanced up once, then again. I didn't look back. I finished what I was doing and left the room. The next day at work, she sent me a message through the internal system. Short, neutral, work-related. I replied with the same tone and added 2 people she usually avoided looping in. The conversation ended there. Later, I saw her with Keller near the elevators. He spoke. She listened, but her attention drifted. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway where I used to appear. I wasn't there. That afternoon, a meeting invite hit my calendar. Optional. HR-led. Topic vague. Emily's name on it. I declined. Nothing dramatic followed. No confrontation. No explanation. But something shifted in the air around her. She started arriving later. Leaving earlier. Her phone stayed in her hand longer than before. Keller still showed up, still commanded attention, but the rhythm between them felt strained, like a performance that required more effort. At home, she asked a question that didn't sound like a question. Something about schedules, about coordination. I answered briefly and went back to what I was doing. Her silence had been meant to pull me closer. My absence did the opposite. By the end of the week, people started asking her where I'd been. Not accusing, curious, as if something was missing from a pattern they were used to seeing. She smiled when they asked. She always smiled, but she started checking over her shoulder more often, as if she'd misplaced something important and couldn't remember exactly when it stopped being there. Keller didn't collapse because of me. He weakened because he underestimated how systems remember patterns. I didn't leak anything. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't make calls that could be traced back to emotion. I stayed exactly where I had always been, inside the numbers, inside the process, inside the quiet spaces people ignored because they trusted them too much. Keller's influence moved through informal pressure, not paperwork. That was his advantage. It was also his weakness. One afternoon, compliance circulated a routine request for historical modeling assumptions tied to external investments. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just a standard sweep tied to a regulatory refresh. I was copied by default. Emily was not. I answered thoroughly. Precisely. I included scenario variances that had previously been dismissed as unlikely. I didn't highlight names. I highlighted exposure paths. 2 days later, Risk followed up with clarifying questions. Legal joined the thread shortly after. The conversation stayed professional, neutral, but Keller's project appeared in every example without ever being called out. At the same time, a separate review surfaced around conflict of interest disclosures. Someone had noticed inconsistencies in meeting logs versus declared interactions. No accusations, just questions. Emily's department was suddenly busy. At work, she moved differently. Less open, more guarded. Her meetings with Keller shortened. Their proximity became deliberate rather than natural. When he spoke, she listened, but her confidence flickered. She started checking her phone mid-conversation, something she never used to do. At home, she stayed later. Said little. Watched me more closely than before. Once, she paused in the hallway as if about to speak, then turned away. Keller's presence on the floor changed too. He still smiled, still commanded attention. But people began to keep distance. Conversations ended sooner. Doors closed more often. One morning, an internal note went out about rescheduling an investor briefing. Keller's name wasn't listed as lead anymore. Another partner was added alongside him. Shared authority. That afternoon, I passed Emily near the elevators. She stopped this time, just for a second. Her eyes searched my face, looking for something familiar. I nodded politely and kept walking. The balance hadn't flipped loudly. It hadn't announced itself, but it had shifted. Keller no longer stood above the structure, and Emily no longer knew where I stood at all. The shift became visible when it stopped being private. It happened during a cross-department session that should have been routine. HR, finance, compliance, a few senior managers. Emily was leading, as usual. Calm voice. Controlled pacing. The room followed her rhythm the way it always had. But this time, something was off. Questions came faster. Not aggressive, just precise. Someone asked about escalation paths. Someone else referenced documentation that hadn't existed a month earlier. A third voice wondered aloud why certain approvals had bypassed standard review. Emily answered smoothly at first, then more carefully, then with a pause she didn't fill right away. Across the table, I watched her recalibrate in real time. She adjusted her posture, shifted tone, smiled once, then stopped. No one accused her. No one mentioned Keller. But his absence from the conversation was louder than his presence had ever been. After the meeting, the hallway filled with low voices. Not gossip. Assessment. People didn't cluster around her like before. They nodded, polite, distant, already turning toward other conversations. Later that afternoon, I heard someone say they hadn't realized how much access HR had been granting lately. Another voice replied that things were being tightened up. Emily stood nearby, pretending not to listen. Her smile stayed in place. Her eyes didn't. At home that evening, she moved restlessly, opened her laptop, closed it, picked up her phone, put it down. She watched me from the corner of her vision as if waiting for something I wasn't offering. The next day, Keller arrived unexpectedly. Not announced, not escorted. He spoke to her near the elevators, too close, too intent. She didn't mirror his energy. She glanced around, checking who could see. Someone could. By the afternoon, an email circulated about revised client interaction protocols. Neutral language. Company-wide distribution. Emily's department copied in full. People started connecting dots quietly. Not enough to accuse. Enough to step back. That was the real loss. Status doesn't fall when it's attacked. It falls when people stop leaning toward it. I felt her attention turn toward me then. Not emotionally. Strategically. Like someone reassessing a variable they'd assumed was fixed. She didn't speak. Didn't ask. She just realized she was standing in the middle of a room that no longer adjusted itself around her. Emily reached out when she realized no one else was steady anymore. It didn't start with words. It started with proximity. She began timing her movements to mine again. Appearing in shared spaces at home. Sitting closer on the couch without touching. Standing in doorways a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to pull her back into alignment. At work, she hovered on the edge of my routines. Not directly. Never directly. She joined meetings she didn't need to attend. Walked the long way past my section of the floor. Asked neutral questions in group threads that didn't require my input, but always landed in my field of vision. I stayed exactly as I was. Her isolation didn't look dramatic. It looked quiet. Invitations slowed. Side conversations ended when she approached. People responded politely, then disengaged. The informal power she'd built through access and presence had thinned. Not gone. Just unreliable. Keller faded fast. Not publicly removed. Simply deprioritized. His messages took longer to get answered. His meetings were shorter. When he did appear, he no longer drew a crowd. The gravity had shifted away from him. That left Emily exposed. At home, she stopped closing doors. Left her phone on the counter more often. Mentioned work in vague terms, as if inviting a response. I gave none. One evening, she sat across from me at the table and watched me eat. She didn't touch her food. She said my name once. Just once. Not to accuse. Not to apologize. To test whether it still worked. I looked up, acknowledged her, and went back to what I was doing. That was when the control broke. Not loudly. Not visibly. But in the way her breathing changed. In the way she shifted in her chair like someone who'd realized the floor beneath them wasn't solid anymore. She had lost Keller's leverage. She had lost the room's attention. And now she was losing the one constant she'd assumed would remain no matter how far she leaned away. I stayed present. Calm. Unmoved. At work the next day, someone asked me a question they used to route through her. It wasn't intentional. It was instinct. Emily noticed. She stood nearby, listening, saying nothing, watching a role she thought she owned slip into neutral space. By the end of the week, she wasn't silent anymore. She was alone. And I was right there, close enough to see it, distant enough that she couldn't reach me. The confrontation didn't arrive as a scene. It arrived as inevitability. She waited until the apartment was quiet, until there were no screens between us, no movement to hide behind. She stood near the window, arms crossed loosely, posture controlled but no longer confident. The distance she'd maintained for days finally collapsed into stillness. She spoke my name again, this time with weight. She asked what was happening. Not accusing, not emotional, careful, as if choosing the wrong word might lock a door she still hoped was open. I didn't answer right away. I didn't rush to fill the space. I let the silence settle the way she'd once let it sit between us, confident it would do the work for her. She continued, softer now. She said she felt like she'd lost me without being able to point to a moment when it happened. She said things felt off, that I felt different, distant, above her, not beside her. I told her I was exactly where I'd always been. That confused her. I could see it in the way her brow tightened, in the way she shifted her weight. She wanted a reason, a trigger, something she could negotiate with or undo. She mentioned work, pressure, change. She said things had gotten complicated, that she'd needed space, that she hadn't meant for it to go this far. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge her version of events. I didn't ask about Keller. I didn't need to. When she finished, she waited, expecting response, explanation, reassurance. I told her I wasn't chasing silence anymore. That was all. No accusations. No raised voice. No list of grievances. Just a boundary stated without emotion. She tried again. asked what I wanted, asked where we stood. I told her I wasn't standing anywhere that required permission. That was when she understood the conversation wasn't about repair. It was about position. She reached for something familiar then. A memory. A shared routine. Something that used to pull me back into orbit. It didn't land. Her control had always come from knowing how to pull me closer. Now she didn't know how to reach me at all. When the conversation ended, nothing was resolved. No promises made. No rules set. But something was clear. I wasn't waiting anymore. And she couldn't tell whether I was leaving or simply no longer available to follow. The collapse didn't announce itself. It arrived in fragments, spaced just far enough apart that she couldn't brace for them. At work, the ground continued to thin beneath her. A senior manager reassigned a responsibility she'd always owned without discussion. Another meeting went forward without her name on the invite. Someone else began handling a relationship she'd curated for years. Not aggressively, just efficiently. Emily noticed everything. Her posture tightened. Her movements became sharper, less fluid. She compensated with longer hours, louder confidence, more visible effort. It didn't restore what she'd lost. It only made the absence clearer. Keller stopped appearing altogether. No explanation. No goodbye. His access badge expired quietly. His name disappeared from threads that used to revolve around him. Whatever leverage he'd offered evaporated the moment scrutiny replaced indulgence. That was when the memories started surfacing for her. Not nostalgia. Impact. She watched me prepare for work one morning and paused, staring as if seeing the routine for the first time. The way I organized without asking. The way decisions had always landed cleanly because I'd absorbed the uncertainty before it reached her. Later, she passed my office and stopped. Not to speak, just to stand there, watching me work, expression unreadable. She remembered how often I'd been there when things went wrong, invisible because nothing ever broke. At home, the apartment felt larger, quieter. She moved through it like someone who'd arrived too late to stop a departure that hadn't technically happened yet. She tried to reassert normalcy, cooked dinner, mentioned a shared plan from years ago. It sounded rehearsed, like something pulled from storage, not memory. I stayed consistent, calm, present, unavailable. The final shift came when she realized there was no audience left for her unraveling. Friends stopped checking in. Work contacts stayed formal. Keller was gone, and I wasn't reacting. One evening, she sat alone in the living room long after the lights outside dimmed. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just sat there, shoulders slightly rounded, hands resting where her phone used to be. She finally understood something then. She hadn't lost control because of exposure. She'd lost it because the one person who had always absorbed the weight quietly had stepped out of position. And now there was nothing left to lean on. Not even my silence. The ending didn't come with a decision announced out loud. It came with a pause long enough that there was nothing left to misunderstand. She approached me carefully, as if sudden movement might break whatever thin line still connected us. Her voice was steady, but the confidence behind it was gone. She didn't ask about work. She didn't mention Keller. She didn't try to explain the silence anymore. She said she saw it now. Not what she'd done, but what she'd lost. She spoke about pressure, about momentum, about how everything had started to feel like leverage instead of life. She said she hadn't realized when I stopped being present because I'd always been quiet, always reliable, always there without demanding space. She said she thought silence was safe. I listened, fully, without interruption. When she finished, the room didn't rush to fill itself. The quiet stayed where it was, heavy but clean. Not punishment, not drama, just clarity. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I told her I'd simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. That was the first time her composure cracked. Not visibly, internally. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped, in the way she exhaled, as if something she'd been holding up alone had finally fallen. She asked what came next. I told her I wasn't rebuilding anything that depended on me being smaller. I told her if there was going to be a future, it wouldn't be based on convenience, silence, or access. It would exist on new ground. One where presence was chosen, not assumed. Where distance wasn't used as control. Where respect came before influence. I didn't promise to stay. I didn't threaten to leave. I stayed exactly where I was. She nodded slowly. Not relieved. Not hopeful. Acknowledging the cost. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No public fallout. No sudden reconciliation. Just a recalibration. She moved differently, spoke differently, listened more than she filled space. She no longer assumed my availability, and I didn't rush to offer it. The game didn't change because I took something from her. It changed because I stopped giving what she thought was guaranteed. I never chased her silence. I let it echo until it taught us both what it was worth. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.